Great. Good evening, everybody. My name's John Williams. I'm a soil scientist with ADAS in the UK, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to this webinar, to welcome you to the webinar looking at the pros and cons of multi-species swards. The work presented today is part of the Super G project, which is a Horizon 2020 project looking at ways of improving the management of permanent grassland. Before we get going, just want to go through some of the housekeeping. Hopefully most of you are familiar now with the housekeeping rules with Zoom presentations. All attendees will be automatically muted, so you don't need to worry about making noises and things in the background. We will be having questions and answer questions given to each of the presentations during the presentations, and it would be useful if you could put those questions into the Q&A function rather than the chat box to ask the questions. If you see questions there which you think are more relevant, you can upvote them so ahead of other people's questions, so we get more of a chance of asking those questions by clicking the thumbs up icon in the Q&A function. If things happen with bandwidths and the like, or the broadband kicks off or whatever, then often it's easy just to leave and rejoin, and that should help fix any issues that we have with the getting through the software. I hope you don't mind, but the webinar will be recorded, and just to be aware of that so that anyone can come and listen back to it at the later. And we will have a feedback survey at the end, which we will be very, very grateful if you could all fill in. Thank you very much. So that's all the housekeeping. And if we look at the agenda this evening, we have 3 excellent presentations. We're very lucky to have the speakers here tonight, very good speakers, where we are going on a mini tour of Northwestern Europe, looking at the experiences and sharing experiences with multi-species swards, first in the northeast of England, then we're crossing the Irish Sea to Northern Ireland, and then heading down to over the channel to Normandy, and where we will have presentations, each lasting around about 20 minutes to go through the experiences of these different sites. We'll have question and answers, as I say, during the presentations, and also after the presentations we'll have expert panel where we can have a discussion, which will include Claire Carres from Normandy, James Drummond from up in the northeast of England there, Phrygian Jones from the working up in Scotland, and Paul Ewell-Price from ADAS, as well as Dale Orr from Northern Ireland, and David Patterson from AFBI. So without further ado, we can go on to our first presentation from James Drummond and Paul Ewell-Price, who are talking about the integrating herbs into grass clover swards at Leamington Hill Head Farm in Northumberland. Over to you, chaps.
Thanks, John. Yeah, real pleasure to be talking today and just opening things up. I think we've got 20 minutes. We'll see how far we get in those 20 minutes and then stop, if not before. Yeah, so really we're talking today, and I'll pass it on to James in a minute, but it's really talking about pros and cons of multi-species swards in the context of the trials we're doing at Leamington Hill Head, and the sort of general approach that James has to multi-species swards on the farm. So from the researcher's perspective, our objective from the trial, at least, which we'll come on to, is to determine the effect of selected grass herb mixes. These are herb mixes that James has selected and particularly interested in. So the effect of those on sward and livestock performance, but also we're looking at sort of nutrient management side of things. So the impact of applying pea fertilizer on his low P soils, plus the impact of a range of mineral nitrogen fertilizer applications. So we'll come on to that, but I'll ask James first of all to sort of give his perspectives on the the objective of the trial and his general approach.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so I suppose a bit of a background into why I quite like herb legume lays and why I'm using quite a few of them now. Few different reasons, really. We're sheep and beef farmers here. Sheep's sort of the main enterprise, and we've got quite prolific sheep, and we've just actually started using a prolificity gene in a new line. So we're going to have a lot of high multiples on farm. So that's a lot of ewes with triplets, a lot of hogs rearing too. And the herb legume lays, when we first started using them sort of 8 years ago, were a great tool to actually manage these animals. I don't want to be lifting them and rubbing on. It's a lot of extra work. I'd rather just be able to evaluate the genetic potential of the ewe, and to be able to do that, I want to leave all the lambs on her, and I don't want it to be my management that hinders her potential genetic ability. So we need to make sure we've got good quality pasture in front of them, and to do that, and especially the high multiples, these multi-species swards are really important. They're really good, high quality feed during lactation. So we've noticed better performance from them animals on them. Not only slightly better improved daylight weight gain in lambs, but we get a lot better function in the ewes as well. So they've got the ability to keep milking and keep performing well in them animals. Another big part when we first got into these multi-species swards was the drought tolerance. The farm's quite exposed in the east. We are northern, but we still do get quite dry weather, especially in the summer. And we're quite prone to burning off on quite a few of our shallow soils. So having these deep tap rooting species on farm is really important to help actually ensuring we can keep pasture in front of them. What we do breeding wise, we've got to run quite a few animals on through the summer. We can't start culling early. We've got a lot of rams and replacements that go onto other people's farms. So we need a good supply of forage right throughout the summer. Grass grows well at this time of year. May, June, it's producing, but it's not through the summer, especially dry summers. Whereas using these multi-species swards, we can ensure we've got a good quality feed and a good growth in them pastures going into the summer, and that's really beneficial for us in our system. I started using them after going to New Zealand as part of a Nuffield scholarship. I saw farmers out there using them for hogget rearing, for high multiple rearing. Really liked the idea of them. So when I came back, I went quite New Zealand approach in my mixes. So the picture we've got here is when we first started putting them in, it was a plantain clover lay, and this is what really got me into sort of multi-species swards. It started off quite simple, quite a few problems we found with it. It performed well, the live weight gain, the animal performance and the stocking rate was tremendous on it, but we had problems in wet conditions with poaching. The persistency of the plant here, plantain's very good the first couple of years here. It starts to die out in the third, fourth. The counts are all right, but they're not great. When we weren't sowing a grass species with them, we ended up with weed grass coming away. So actually you had to go in with a reseed once the plantain had died out. You had tremendous clover, but just weed grass. So it wasn't really a viable lay. So we sort of changed what we were doing. The mix started sort of tinkering with grass components in there, what we were putting in. And actually that's gone from having quite a lot of diploids in to actually going now for more of a hybrid ryegrass and a small amount of diploid. We find that fits in quite well. It gives us a good boost of grass early season from the hybrid, but then actually that erect upright growth in the hybrids, actually it doesn't till it and try and smother out the other parts of the lay. And one big problem we've found when we've started using these lays, like red clover, you get a lot of intestinal torsion, so red gut, some people would call it. And the problem with that is it's killing lambs. So they're performing well. There's always your top performers that get it, but there's just too much forage going through them too quickly, and it twists the intestines, and you get the torsion that kills them. So we started playing with sandfoin a bit, and the first year we used the sandfoin, absolutely tremendous, eliminated any torsions in the lambs. Problem we then found with sandfoin was the persistency. You only get a couple of years out of it. And it was the condensed tannins in the sandfoin that we found that was reducing the torsions. So these are also found in bird's foot trefoil and in chicory. So we've started playing a bit more with them on farm, and that's when sort of met Paul and we got in to the trial plots with the Super G project. And now on farm, we've gone from that sort of initial plantain-based lay to actually incorporating more species. So in our mixes we put in the rest of the farm, we've got a lot of sandfoil, a lot of birds at trefoil, chicory, and we're putting other sort of components in there. And we've dialed back that grass quite a bit. We're finding diploids, if you put too much diploid in to start with, it tillers and smothers everything out. So you need a very low amount of diploid just to fill in the later years when other species start to die out. So we've tried quite a few establishment methods here on farm. A lot of it's done direct drilling. The very first lay we put in 14, that was the last time we ever ploughed or did any heavy cultivation for these swards. Since then, there's been a lot of direct drilling into permanent pasture or into temporary lays. And we've actually, like the slide shows, put some in with a low rate of a hybrid brassica. We put this in later season. It works quite well to try and maintain moisture. The canopy gets up quite quickly on the brassica and we get a good moisture retention. It helps smother the weeds. We're quite weedy here. We get a lot of annual weeds, and that could be a major problem with the multi-species lays. You can't spray them with anything. So you're limited really in your options there. So if you can try and mitigate how many weeds you're going to get in the first place, it helps. So we put it in with either a hybrid brassica like in these photos. We can use it to transition ewes off the herb legume lays onto their winter grazing when they'll be on a kale swede mix. It's quite a nice little period as they graze these plots just to transition. And another big way we put it in on farm is with arable silage. So we put in a low rate of oats. We put about 75 kilos to the hectare of oats as we establish our multi-species swards. And that gives a nice sort of boost to the establishment yield. And then you can go in, cut that. We do it very early, sort of a green silage. So before the grain gets even watery, nowhere near milky. So it doesn't pull too many nutrients out of the ground and it gives us a higher quality silage. But the main thing that it does is you're taking out the annual weeds. We'll grow red shank, fat hen, chickweed for fun. Like, we're tremendous at growing it, and it's just a useless thing to have on farm. At least with that early cut, we're cleaning them up and it gives us a really nice clean lay afterwards. And that, I suppose, is one of the big issues with establishing multi-species swards. If it's going from we're not really conventional, but someone that was quite conventional, putting a lot of sprays on farm, there's nothing you do. So you need to try and mitigate any of that before you establish a sward. If you're going into permanent pasture and it's been weedy, I really would try and recommend sorting out the weed issue the year before if you can, and then go into the multi-species swards. They're tremendous things to have, but you are limited with options somewhat. Some of the things we've really found with these since day one is the grazing management of them. They have to be rotational graze. They love a rest period. They'll produce loads of high quality forage for you, but you need to be giving them a rest to enable them to do that. The picture we've got here on screen is what we've sort of evolved our mix into now on farm, away from the Super G trial, which is essentially examining these components individually and looking at what performance benefits and persistency and nutrient management we need for each component, but put together in the sward, the bursford trefoil, that chicory plantain, a bit of sandfoil in there for the first couple of years is sort of what's driving the multi-species mixes that I use now. We get tremendous animal performance on it, and that drought tolerance really is handy. I know some people have been wet this last week or so. We've had nothing. We're starting to burn off on a lot of the grass fields. It's a couple more weeks without any rain. We'll be struggling if we didn't have these sort of lays on farm. They can produce for us. They've got the taproot. They've got the mineral profile as well. So you're going to help animal performance as well as getting that moisture up when there's not about, and we can keep animals growing. A big thing, as I said, that grazing management, they really do perform better. You get a lot better persistency if you're doing the rotational grazing. We try and go for sort of a 3-day graze, but that is flexible on the time of year. Early season, just after lambing, the mows be grazing a bit longer. Once we can get mobbed up and get moving around paddocks, we try and keep it to quite a short grazing interval, and it helps the persistency. Animals will selectively graze on these. You're giving them a lot of choice, and animals are picky, especially sheep. They will graze out certain species. We've seen when we did leader follower systems with sheep coming in behind lambs, a high priority stock, they just selectively grazed exactly the same species, and they hindered their persistency in the sward. We're doing quite a lot of leader follower now with cattle coming in behind, so we put priority stock in front on these rotations. That would be basically growing lambs, or at the minute ewes that are lactating with lambs at foot, and we can reset that residual better and more evenly with cattle following in behind. So instead of trying to take everything down, they will select certain components over others. So instead of trying to get everything quite even with sheep, we can come in with cows behind. They just take a big mouthful. They take a nice sort of even residual when they leave the paddock. So the cattle are quite good at our system. We have them. We didn't really have many before. We've upped the numbers just to try and improve our grazing management and the persistency of these. And it's kind of evolving what we do. The mix that we have here on farms evolving and how we manage them. But we have started increasing the diversity we're growing, and certainly the cattle cleaning in behind the readers help the persistency of them. And what we've done with Paul, that's very much looking at persistency, although we've found a few things that maybe aren't great. And the main thing from that is set stock. And we want performance data from these trial plots. We have to set stock them for 8 weeks to get that performance data. And I think it's shown just how much that set stock and hinders persistency on these. We put in 5 new plots, all different mixes. I think Paul's going to touch on that in a second. And a track at the top. The persistency on the track has been a lot better than the plots, because we just put animals in for a day every month or so to clean it up, and it's still how it was sown. And yeah, part of the management is just getting it grazed right. It's going to help your persistency a lot. Is there anything else you want me to touch on now, Paul? Or
well, that's great. Thanks, James. I'll just take us through the sort of trial itself. So basically, looking at the trial setup, and then we've got a bit of data which pretty much just illustrates what James has been saying. So we'll see how much of that we'll get through. But we've got some data to look at basically how well things established last year and then into this year. A bit on effect of the nitrogen application rates on quality in the different blocks, and then effect of the phosphorus applications we're doing. But this slide just shows you the setup. So we've got 5 blocks, 5 treatments. We've got this base mix, which is the ryegrass, white clover, plantain mix James has mentioned. And then we're basically superimposing, so adding the herbs and legumes on top of that. So the second treatment was that base mix with samphorn added to it. The third one's got bird's foot trefoil added. And then with the fourth and fifth are basically playing on that a little bit. So the fourth one is half rate of samphorn and bird's foot trefoil with the sort of standard base mix. And then the fifth one was again half samphorn, bird's foot trefoil, but halving the seed rate for the base mix, just to see what effect that had. So that's what's happening in each of the blocks, and then superimposed on each of the blocks, we've got the phosphate application. So 80 kilograms of triple superphosphate, or 80 kilograms of phosphate per hectare as triple superphosphate applied to one side and not applied to the other. As I say, these are low P state of soil, so we wanted to see what effect that had on performance or on yield, but also possibly persistence of the herbs. Then as well as that, we've got the nitrogen rates, the 4 different N treatments. So no nitrogen, 40 kilograms of N, 70 and 100. This is just showing some of the field team in action on the next slide, Sarah. So yeah, we set up growth cages on each of the N and so on the nitrogen and the phosphate treatment, so we could keep track of grass growth and quality. James, I don't know if you want to say anything more about the setup there. Setup to provide water. Clipex fencing.
Yeah, so we split up after we sowed the plots. So Steve, as part of the project, came in and GPS'd the trial plots. We got them direct drilled, 2 passes to give a better coverage of the sown species, and then we split up with Clipex, sort of permanent fencing pretty much, but it's quite quick to put up, and got the water infrastructure put in place. As Paul said, there's the P and no P, half of each field. The results are quite good in that last year, so we've randomized that this year. And the 4 treatments of nitrogen throughout the year. So there's cages on all of them sites on all 5 of the plots. Animals that say will graze, and you've got to get on the cages quickly because if it grows out the top, they'll graze through the cage as well. But we can see the preference, we can see what's grown in the cages and what's actually left in the field, and also get a yield of what's been grown as well, having them exclusion cages there.
Great, okay, so we'll have a quick look at some of the data. I'll just whisk through these. Yeah, so first slide, just looking at establishment. We've got pie charts for each of the treatments, the 5 blocks with the different species mixes in them, just split by ryegrass, clover, the sown herb, proportion of the sward that is the sown herbs, and then other species. So you'll see that good amounts of ryegrass and clover, as you'd expect. The hatched is the sown herb, so you can see that in the sainfoin, but more so in the bird's foot trefoil block, we're getting decent amounts of sown herbs in that first year to June. So we're talking establishment was autumn, so late summer, autumn 2019. This is June 2020. But yeah, the best blocks in terms of establishment was with the bird's foot trefoil and the sainfoin sown on their own. If we go on to the next slide, this takes us through to May this year. And as James was mentioning, we've set stock so we can get the livestock performance, and this has had an effect on persistence. So if we just click through the pie charts here, they should come on. Yeah, so click on again. It's showing the change from 2020 to 21. You can see by May this year, there's not much of the sown herbs left. You can see in the BFT top right, 3% of the sward is bird's foot trefoil. So there's a bit of bird's foot trefoil there. Sainfoin seems to have gone, and not much persistence on the other blocks. So yeah, this does seem to be an issue where we are set stocking, so worth bearing in mind. Move on to the next slide. So just a little bit about quality. So this is looking at results by June last year, so early season last year. No difference in yield between the different blocks. You'll see on the left there, that's just kilograms dry matter per hectare. And then on the right, no difference in digestibility between the treatments. And then the next slide. Again, no difference in ME or crude protein between the treatments. So they are performing in a very similar way across the board. We'll go on to the next slide. So this is just looking at total grass yield for the whole season in 2020. So look across the cuts that we were doing in the grass growth cages from sort of June right through to end of September. It looks as if those plots or those blocks with the herbs in them are doing better than the grass, clover, plantain base mix over the whole course of the whole season. If we go on to the next slide, this takes us through to 2021. So at the moment, we've just got fresh weight yields and waiting for the dry matters, but it's showing a similar pattern in that the herb blocks that, across the board seem to do a bit better than that block with the grass, clover, plantain base mix. Next slide. So moving on now to looking at the effect of the nitrogen. So this is again is total grass yield for the whole of last season in 2020, and the effect of the different N rates is just showing that unless you get to 100 kilograms of N per hectare, it's a pretty similar total grass yield, because as your N rate increases, the influence of the legumes reduces probably, but you're getting that slightly higher yield at the higher N rate is the general pattern. Next slide. And then again, looking at this year's results. So this is early season growth, cold April, cold dry April, cold wet May, meaning we're not getting much nitrogen through from the legume content, clover and legume content. It's showing quite a response there from the 40 kilograms of N that was applied. So you've got the 0N and the 40N treatment in each block, showing you a pretty consistent response to that early season nitrogen. Moving on, Next slide. So yeah, this is just showing the effect of the nitrogen application rate on the species mixes. So yeah, despite these N rates up to 70 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, it doesn't seem to be having a big impact on the clover content or the sown herb content in that first year. And the last one on N, is it? Yeah, so last one on nitrogen, in terms of the nitrogen rate, didn't seem to have an effect on ME, but did seem to have an effect. If we look on the chart on the right, crude protein by nitrogen treatment, for early season grazing, the higher nitrogen rate seemed to improve or increase the crude protein in the sward. So quite a lot of data, but just picked out a few bits and pieces there. I think we've got one more now on phosphorus. So this is an interesting one. Again, this is setting out the P response by block. So we've got total grass yield on the y-axis, P0 compared to 80 kilograms of phosphate per hectare, and you'll see consistently by block we're getting this response from the P application. It's a split field layout, so a bit suspicious this might be a sort of field effect, which is why, as James said, we've now randomized it for this season to see if we get the same effect from the P application this year. Next slide. Yeah, so I'll pass on to James for the livestock performance to finish off. Yeah.
No time for that, John?
I just quick couple of minutes, James. That'd be brilliant, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be quick on this. Well, it says it on the graphs there, really, doesn't it? Yeah. How we performed each block. 8-week weights on the lambs were performing better where we had the bird's foot trefoil. Looking at that, the poorest one was the one with the standard grass and the half grass, and then actually the kilogram gain per hectare was better on the bird's foot trefoil as well. And I think them results were repeated this year as well. We did 8-week weights about a week ago. They outperformed on the bird's foot trefoil plots, both I think in stock and density and live weight gain per animal and per hectare. So bird's foot is doing quite well so far.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, James. Thanks, Paul. I'm wondering if we take some of this discussion further on into the Q&A at the end.
Yeah, we can cover that. No problem. Yeah,
cover that. I mean, that's obviously a very important part of the project to discuss the performance of the animals at the end of the day. So that's something for everyone to hold back on and think about when we have the Q&A, if that's okay. But that's great. Thanks ever so much. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A, which again, I think for the consideration of time, we'll take those in the at the discussion session at the end of the presentation. So moving very swiftly on, if we could move to across the Irish Sea over to beautiful County Down, and David Patterson and Dale Orr will take us through their experiences. Over to you, gents.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, what I would like to do is take the first 10 minutes or so and look at the theme for tonight, the pros and cons of multi-species swards from the research perspective, and bringing in some of our recent AFB trial results. And then we'll swing over and bring Dale Orr into the equation, and we'll look and hear from him as to his practical experience at farm level and how he has incorporated successfully or not, as the case may be, on some occasions, into his organic farm system in Strangford, County Down. Okay, thank you. So just some of the pros that have been frequently outlined, and you've probably all seen some of these before. With multi-species swards, there's opportunities to extend the grazing season, increase productivity. They're more resilient swards, improved carbon sequestration, reduced need for fertilizer, etc., etc. And animal benefits there in terms of parasite control and environmental benefits in terms of greater biodiversity, both above and below ground. Thank you, Sarah. And some of the research, I'm not going to go through a lot of the different areas being researched right now, but research that was done in UCD in Dublin, which AFB was involved with as well. It was the Smart Grass project, or Smart Grassland Systems, where they looked basically at lots of different combinations of mixtures of grasses, legumes, and herbs. On the next slide, you'll see some of these studies were largely done in the early stages anyway with sheep grazing. And there was I've grossly over summarized the findings from that, but there was less animal medicines required, a higher yield of herbage with lower nitrogen inputs, and importantly, there was an increased or faster rate of gain by the lambs, reaching market weight that bit sooner, leading to greater profitability. I know Dale will touch on that later on. Thank you, sir. In terms of the animal health benefits, I'm talking there about minerals and parasites. The plantain can bring up and draw up higher levels of calcium and cobalt, for example. Chicory has higher levels of magnesium and zinc, which is all good. And there's also good research coming through in our literature review that we're doing at the moment. Chicory and bird's foot trefoil, which you've heard a lot about already, ribwort plantain and yarrow have all been reported in different trials to show a reduced parasite burden, at least in sheep. Next slide. In terms of the soil health, what's going underneath the surface, we had a PhD student, Chris Broughton, last year. He was doing studies below ground on worm populations, both at AFB and some of our grazing studies, and down south at the Devonish site in Douth. And what he found basically was that there was a higher earthworm abundance underneath the multi-species swards when compared with nearby reseeded or permanent pastures. And it was these anisic species, the ones that are the long, deep, vertical burrowing type worms. And there was more of those in particular, which is great, because this species is the one that contributes more to improving soil hydraulic conductivity and its nutrient cycling, and improving the soil structure. So again, all very positive, but early preliminary findings. Again, thinking of early preliminary findings, our EcoSward trials down at Loch Gall. These were established back in autumn 2019. There was 2 trials there, 2 very simple trials. One was simply looking at the yield performance of individual component species. So we had, and you can see in the photograph there, we have individual plots of pure plantain, pure chicory, pure grass varieties, and pure clovers. In the second trial, it's a mixture comparison, and we'll maybe touch on that in a moment just to speed up. Go to the next slide, please. So the trial details in terms of establishment, and I think this is important with the theme tonight of establishment and management and so on. These were sown into clean ground, and James has really been referring to the importance of getting the weed control sorted out before the multi-species go in. But we had conventional ground preparation in terms of ploughing, and then shallow drilling, trying to get the seeds into that top sort of 1 centimeter or 10 mils of at the top soil surface. Fertilizer was relatively modest right across the trials, about 80 kilograms of nitrogen applied in the spring across all plots, and the grass-only plots got a top-up later on in the summer of another approximately 70 kilograms of nitrogen. Simulated grazing was the treatment or the defoliation practice, and that we're trying to mimic grazing by using that Holdrup harvester that you saw in the photograph. At least eight harvests across the season, and importantly, we're cutting at 15 to 20 centimeters down to about 7.5 centimeters, but doing that mechanically. The number of grazings started off on the 27th of April. We had, I think, 8 grazings in 2020, finishing off on 28th of October, with an average regrowth interval, which is important back to some of James's points. 26-day regrowth interval, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. It was dictated by the height of the herbage when exactly we took a cut. There's some interesting research I was just reviewing last night, actually, and it was the first time I'd come across it. I don't know why I hadn't seen it before, but the New Zealand targets for first-time grazing on a newly established sward, I think it was wait until 6 leaves are present on the plantain and 7 leaves are present on the chicory plants. because this gives them a better opportunity to establish, especially in that first establishment phase. Next slide, please. Just to show you some of the photographs of what these pure sown plots actually looked like. A tall fescue one on the left-hand side and a white clover one on the right. Next slide. And the plantain in particular, you can see they're shot from two different angles, established tremendously well. There were harsh post-sowing conditions in that particular trial. In autumn 2019, the trial was sown in early September, first week of September, but the plantain and all of the grasses and most of the clovers all established surprisingly well. And 1 year further on, this photograph on the right-hand side, taken from a slightly higher angle, shows you that the plantain grown singly by itself suffered very little in terms of wheatgrass invasion or broadleaf weeds for that matter. Next slide, please. This is some of the cons coming in here. Pure sown chicory didn't fare so well. Maybe we should have looked at the slightly higher seeding rate, but I think that the bigger factor was probably it just did not like being sown that late and would take a longer time to establish. And you can see even from that distant shot there that there was a lot of annual meadowgrass, wheatgrass invasion came into the plot. And by comparison, the tall fescue plot just shows you exactly the same location, same conditions, albeit slightly harsh conditions post-sowing. A grass is still, very reliable in terms of its ability to establish and thicken up over the course of a year. Next slide, please. Some of the early results, these are just preliminary findings. They're only fresh weights taken from 2020 season, but you can see from all of the bars across, the bars mostly to the left-hand side are dominated by the herb components, if you want to say it that way. The bar finisher is a no grass mixture. That's purely red clover, white clover, and herbs. Tonic plantain right beside, the bar blanca and the commander chicory are the relatively speaking, the higher yielding plots right across the 8 cuts of the 2020 season. And the grasses, as you can see, the light green bars over towards the right-hand side, as a group, there's not much difference between them, but poorer yielding, and I put a fair bit of that down to the late dry spring that we had in 2020. Okay, next slide, please. In the mixture comparison, went in at the same time, same conditions, same establishment method. The only difference in mixture A and mixture B in this second trial is the addition of the tonic plantain and commander chicory that you can see in the seed rate on the right-hand side there. Next slide, please. And over the 8 cuts in last year in 2020, quite a substantive difference there in terms of just the herbage produced. Mixture B, the inclusion of the herbs seemed to have a very dramatic effect in terms of the sward production. And on the next slide, you'll see the first 2 cuts, only 2 cuts from the 2021 season in April and May. And you can see there straight away, the red and blue is first and second cut, but mixture B again is out yielding the mixture A. So these are all preliminary results. We haven't had years and years of data to show here tonight, but there's early indications of what we've already heard from the previous speakers. The additional herbs going into the mix is adding to the herbage production ability. Okay, next slide. And partly to explain that, this is a very oversimplified diagram of the growth patterns of grasses, legumes, and herbs. But you can see straight away that if you don't have a normal production curve from the grasses, especially in that spring period, which is what we've experienced here in Northern Ireland in 2021 and previously in 2020. If you don't have that burst or boost of grass early in the season, then you're having to rely on the legumes and the herbs filling those gaps, so to speak, and giving a good supply of herbage production for the rest of the season. And I think that largely explains the yield graphs that you've just seen. Okay, next slide. Quickly moving on, this the 2 grazing studies that we've started here at Hillsborough and at Loughgall We have exclusive with groups of cattle and in the Loch Gall case hoggets there. We have exclusive groups which stay on either the grass clover or the grass clover herbs. You can see in the next slide. Just some of the botanics that we've been doing just to get us going on this trial. In the grass clover sward in April of this year, these were sampled. And don't get me wrong, this is a very good grass clover sward, 81% ryegrass, 17% clover, just 2% weeds. But in the next slide, you'll see that sitting side by side with that, in the multi-species sward, slightly lower grass level, slightly lower white clover level, and that's being largely replaced, obviously, by the herbs. But in particular, the plantain is the strongest component there, with 6% in the dry matter contributing from plantain and just 1% from the chicory. And that's maybe one of the cons that we're starting to develop in this story here tonight. The chicory is maybe the one we're really wanting to keep in the sward, but we're struggling. Okay, next slide. And from the animal performance point of view, again, this is very early data, but there's about 5 or 6 weighings have been done so far this spring. And in that April to June period, those dairy-born calves that you saw grazing on the trial are gaining about 1.28 versus those that are on the grass clover of 0.92. So we'll see how that develops, not only over this season, but in the coming years, to get really strong data on that. But the early indications are good in terms of animal performance, which is obviously very important. To conclude this part of the talk, I just want to counterbalance some of the pros that the research is showing. But some of the cons that I'm picking up on here, and just to stimulate some discussion later on, there's basically a lack of long-term studies done on multi-species right around the whole of the UK and Ireland at this point in time. And there's a lot of studies that have started off, like our own, and we're showing preliminary findings. But it's a world apart from all of the encyclopedic knowledge we have of grass swards and all of the trial data that we have at play. We need to better understand the mechanisms involved in terms of this question about over-yielding whenever you combine more and more species together, and the growth cycles that are involved there, the carbon storage, the persistency, which has already been mentioned by others tonight, the nutrient supply issues. There's lots and lots of things that we don't know, and we need to understand these mechanisms to be able to predict and develop management blueprints for farmers in different locations, etc., etc. And in terms of practical issues, there's no one standard multi-species sward type. There's ones with 3 species, 6 species, 12 and beyond. You know, so it's hard to find one standard multi-species sward to compare with, and that is a slight criticism as well. And also re-establishment of herb species, we haven't even really got there at this point with the lack of years in some of these studies. Once the persistency starts to fall off of particular species, what are you going to do? We need to develop ways and means and understanding of how to get those species re-established back into an otherwise healthy sward. There's questions about silage making and weed control, as already been said. I'll finish there just with that impact message at the bottom, and that's just to tease some discussion a wee bit as well. Overall, there's a relatively low rate of reseeding in Northern Ireland across the grassland area. I think it's only about 3.8% of the grassland area per year across farms in Northern Ireland. Maybe not that much difference around the UK, but if you think about multi-species swards coming into that, they could end up just being a niche within what is already a relatively low amount of reseeding taking place. So that's kind of maybe it's not a con. It's not a criticism of multi-species swards, but it's sort of a reality check in terms of the potential impact of these swards. So on the next slide, this is my marker to bring in Dale. I just wanted to finish on the establishment point there. That was a sward that we showed at Loch Gall, which shows similarly what James was talking about earlier, the plethora of broadleaf weeds that we can also grow with a multi-species sward. Photograph on the right shows me trying to rescue a little chicory plant, but there's plenty of red shank and all sorts of other plants around it. So the solution in this particular field was to get sheep in to have a short abrupt grazing with lots of mouths on the field per acre to get a lot of that competing broadleaf weeds decapitated and removed, and then step off and let the sward get fully established. But anyway, I'm bringing Dale very just at this point in time, just to broaden out the discussion from a practical point of view. Maybe Dale, could you tell us just a little bit about your farming setup?
Okay, yes, thank you very much, David. I farm approximately 200 hectares near Downpatrick, County Down. We converted to organic farming in 1998, and we're constantly learning how to maximize our organic production with the use of minimal inputs. We keep a purebred Clin flock. This year we lamb 390 ewes and 90 hoggets, and we keep 100 traditionally bred suckler cows whose progeny we finish as beef. We are currently stocked at about 1.5 livestock units per hectare. I appreciate this may be regarded as quite a low stocking rate, but my philosophy is to maximize profitability by minimizing all inputs, and I've found that our current stocking rate allows us to achieve this. In 2020, our carcass output was 33.8 kilos per ewe, and our gross margin was £889 per hectare. Again, I don't know how these figures compare with other farms, but each farm's different, and we only use our benchmark figures as a target for ourselves and aim to improve against what we did the previous year. Generally, the gross margin per hectare is higher for the sheep, and this is due to the fact that they can be kept outside in grass all year round in our farm, and we can winter them on turnips and kale, and very silage is required to feed them. In 2020, less than 90 silage round bales were required to overwinter the breeding sheep. The farm's divided into 2 blocks. Churchtown Farms, our home farm, is 127 hectares, and it's pretty much one block of land with the farmyard centrally located. The fields are subdivided into paddocks for rotational grazing, and the average paddock size is around 5 acres. The land could be described as free draining, like clay soil, with the rock not too far away. It can be grazed with sheep all year round with minimal damage, and the cattle generally graze around 220 days of the year. We lease 77 hectares. It's a single ring fence block of land located about 2 kilometers away from the home farm. It's known as the Mara Estate, and it would be slightly heavier land than our own farm. There's less stones, but there's more soil. It too can carry sheep all year round, but it would only be capable of carrying cattle for about 200 days of the year. Again, all the fields have been subdivided to facilitate rotational grazing.
That's great, Dale, thank you. There's a slide that's popped up there just to show your net data from that location, just for the audience's benefit. You can see there, I think straight away, the point you were making, dry springs, March, April and May, particularly low rainfall levels for Northern Ireland, maybe for other standards as well, and typical temperatures in the spring, March, April, getting into that 6 or 8 degrees whenever the herbs will start to grow. But could you briefly describe maybe the sort of species that you've used over the years before you got into the multi-species swards?
Sure. We've been organic since 1998, so we're using crop rotations, and we reseed about 30 acres every year. The majority of the fields in the farm would be a dual-purpose white clover ley containing a mixture of perennial ryegrasses and different sized leaf white clovers, such as Aberswan, Aberdye, Alice, and Aberace. We have a small number of fields with highly productive silage red clover swards, with intermediate perennial ryegrasses and persistent red clovers such as Aberclart and Aberchianti. And then the rest of the farm now has been established in these MSS swards.
I think that slide showing there is was that the first?
Yeah, that slide shows our first MSS sward, and we established 25 acres of this in 2018, and we used oats as a nurse crop. The mix was established after a crop of stubble turnips, and it was sown in late May. And although it was slow to establish because of the particularly dry summer in 2018, we still managed to harvest a crop of silage bales at the end of August. and then we grazed it in mid-October with cattle until the end of October.
Noticing there, you have a generous amount of tonic and choice chicory in that particular case. I think that there is a lesson to be learned there in getting a generous amount of seed into the mixture in the first place. But how did that sward perform? Before we quickly move on.
Well, 2019 really was the first year that we could measure a full year annual performance, and we grazed it initially with sheep, and then in June we had to add a batch of in-calf heifers because to tidy up the paddocks after the sheep in a leader-follower system, because the sheep were starting to leave the grasses behind as they were preferentially eating the clover and the herbs. I calculate that the field produced just over 11 tonnes of dry matter per hectare in 2019, because the ewes with lambs were grazing it from the first week of February, and then the in-calf heifers, they were added in June, and they weren't off it until the 28th of October.
And have you tried other established methods and mixtures since then?
Yeah, for that established method, we applied it, and we par hard it twice. We rolled it before sowing, and then we rolled it after sowing. But the following year, we didn't plough at all. We just par hard twice, rolled, sowed, and rolled, and that worked equally well. We didn't really need to plough. In 2019, instead of using oats as a nurse crop, I used Red Start as a cover crop. And the reason I did this was I was already seeing the benefit of the lambs growing really well on the herbal ley or on the MSS. So rather than waiting to take a cut of silage, I'd rather get in and graze it really fast. So we used Red Start as the cover crop, and we were grazing it within 8 weeks of sowing.
And I think there's another mixture just about to show up. Yeah, could you quickly just take us through that one? I know that's the very newest or latest one that you're trying.
Yeah, that's the latest.
What's the thinking behind that one, please?
Yeah, well, that's the latest one. We've had three dry springs out of the last 5 years, and it really impacts on the grass growth in this region. We need as much forage as possible to keep the animals going, and really our philosophy is to get the most that we can from grass. So the reason I'm trialing this, I'm with 14.5 acres of it just in this year, and these are all deep-rooted grasses, the cocksfoot, the meadowfescue, and the timothy, and obviously the red clover and the herbs are all deep-rooted. So the reason for trialing this is to really get a drought-resistant sward that'll give me grass when I need it in the dry spring.
Brilliant. David Dale, this is fantastic, and I'm really sorry to kind of rush you along. I'm just wondering if we have another couple of minutes, if there's any specific details you want to get across before we get into the discussion, which we can pick up a lot of this because it's really useful stuff we're hearing here. But yeah, just in the consideration of time.
There's loads more here, John, but we can save it to later on and maybe preempt some questions that'll come up. Dale, just to finish with, what would you say are the cons? Well, we've heard lots of pros, and I've echoed, and we're both big fans of these multi-species swards for various reasons. But what would you honestly say are the cons? What's the downsides of these swards, please?
Well, the biggest there's a number of cons to these swards. Number one, it's weed control. We have a consistent problem with thistles in the MSS, especially in the year of establishment. Also, they require really good rotational grazing management. They're not suitable for set stocking, especially with the sheep, as they preferentially eat the herbs, especially the chicory, and they would remove it from the sward in the first year if they were given the chance. They require a different rotational grazing management to what most people are used to. You need to leave at least 7 centimeters of the forage behind, and you need to let the sward grow to at least 12 centimeters tall before you let the animals in. Furthermore, with sheep, you need to let them have MSS every single day. Their performance suffers if you alternate between different types of sward. This doesn't seem to be an issue with the cattle, but with the sheep, it really impacts their performance if they're moved between different types of swards. Furthermore, the percentage of the herbs in the sward does decline every year, especially the chicory. The plantain with us seems to be persistent, but the chicory does fall year on year. And obviously the grass seed's more expensive. It costs about £30 more per acre to establish, which for a lot of people is a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll have to draw to a close there, otherwise John will football going on at the moment, he'll blow the whistle on us. But I'm really glad. I'm really glad you shared your experience there tonight, Dale, and I think you've got a career in photography as well, because that's a super photograph that we've just ended up with there at that last slide. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Back to you, John.
David, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. That is, really puts it into context there. I'm certainly getting lots of pros here, but it's nice to have a little bit of a tip towards the cons as well, particularly when we come to the discussion later on. Just as a heads up again, I'm not sure I explained it properly, but we're going to have a quiz or a survey. I think it's probably the best way of looking at it after the next talk. One of these live quiz things that I must admit my technology skills don't allow me to understand how they work, but there will be information on the slides and on the link in the chat as to how we participate in that. But before we get onto that, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Claire Carrez here from the Chambre d'Agriculture de Normandie, says in his Welsh-French accent there. So looking forward to hearing very much about the multi-species sward in Normandy, and I'm sure we'll be able to get through before the kickoff, the big kickoff at 8 o'clock. Claire, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. You can pass, yeah. So I will present you a climate platform. So it's a total of 4 platforms that we tested on grassland species in Normandy. 4 are specialized in cutting mixes, and 1 on grazing that will focus today. We do this these mixes from we'll study during 3 years. So we start last year in 2020 until 2023. It's situated on the west part of Normandy at the farm Blanche Maison, which is an experimental farm, a partner of the project of Super G. And we tested different species. So the basis, English ryegrass and white clover, but also purple clover that we call in France, but it's red clover, it's the same. Tall fescue, chicory, different density. You can pass. You can see just some details of climate in this part, in this farm. This specific is it's Norman's cows. So Norman's cow is really well known for cream and butter. And in this farm, they have a large part of grazing days, so from March to November when it's possible. And the monthly rainfall is close to that you have in UK because the total of year is about 900,000 millimeters, with a temperature very same during all year. And next you see our trial. So we do 3 blocks of that we get repetition of 7 with 6 mixes. And these mixes we study from the implantation. So we seed them on early September, on the 5th of September. We study them all the autumn for the implantation, and then at the beginning of spring, so we start in April, we simulate grazing by cutting every month or every 3 weeks to regard the growth value, the food values, fresh matter, and also dry matter, and sorting species. So the first mixes, M1, is the really most common mixes in Normandy, is English ryegrass and white clover. So we put 2 white clover, 1 giant and 1 intermediate, and you can see how we grow during all autumn and spring. M2 is a mix grazing and cutting. So we tested in all the cutting platform. It's really interesting because it's more resistant in a dry condition with a tall fescue, red clover, dactyl, and lucerne. And it can get the 2 possibility. So as you can see on the first year of exploitation is that the lucerne is really long to get implant. So it's the one that was less important in dry matter. M3 is English ryegrass with a really lot of type of clover, red, hybrid, and white, and also with in grass with tall fescue. So it's really interesting to get mixes with different species, but we said that more than 6 species is less interesting because you don't see all of them at the end. And also red clover get 2-3 years of exploitation maximum. So it's interesting that have different clover in this mix. M4 is really close to M3, but with different proportion and more tall fescue and red clover. And M5 is, as my colleagues, is a test with a chicory and red clover, white clover, and ryegrass. So chicory is interesting, but this cycle is really short. So in grassland mixes, it's important to really get really attentive of when you get grazing or cutting. M6 finally is a mix, a Swiss mix. We tested with the society MEAC, and instead of our mix, get bluegrass or meadow fescue in addition. On the next slide, you see how we do with a different picture, and we estimate 3, but it will be more 4 or 5 cuts in spring and summer 2021. And on the next slide, you see a graph. So it's the plus in March and May, it's when we do the cut. And you see the precipitation, so how the mixes react to precipitation, and especially a big storm that we get in April. And we see that on gross grass, that M5, for example, with chicory, have a really an important reaction after a cut. Instead of the yellow one is ryegrass and white clover, which is really stable during all spring. So it's the first year of exploitation, so we really need to get more information on the autumn and on the second year. On the next slide, you see how in a fresh matter at each cut. So for now we get 4 on a moment, which mixes have more production and more biomass. For now is the one with chicory, M5, but also the M2 that I see with lucerne is more longer. So, and we saw that lucerne is really interesting in dry condition in summer. So it can have really other differences, and we will see at the end of 2021 the total of dry matter. But in orange is close to 1.5 tons of dry matter, and in green is more than 2.5 per cut. On the next slide, you see, so legend is not important, it's just the color, that in green you have a proportion of grass, in blue the proportion of clover, and in red adventice. And so M2 and M3 get more advances, especially because in autumn it was longer to get lucerne and tall fescue, and we get really a wet condition. And on the second slide, you see sorting that we do in May, in end of May, and after exploitation, after cutting, we reduce the part of adventice in each mixes, and especially for example, the M3 that you see that they don't have adventice now, really weeds, for example. Sorry, weeds are really reduced after cutting, and clover and grass are really in a large proportion now after spring. So thank you very much for attention. And you see the platform which was a visit in 10th of June. So it was a big event. We have 600 persons. So it was the first event and after COVID. So it was really important for us to present this platform, and also lots of technical part. Thank you very much.
Claire, that was excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that. That was excellent run through, and thank you for keeping to time. Hopefully we will all get the opportunity to come and see your platform in once the vaccines are completed and we're able to travel again. So thank you very much for that. Excellent. Well, here we go. Well, let's move on to the survey results and all the rest of it now, and we can see here the Mentimeter results.
Yes, so everyone, and some of you already clicked the link on the chat, so you can do this either on your computer or on your phone. Just go to menti.com. I click on the link in the chat, or go to menti.com and put in the code 66380549. So we've had 10 people already respond. We're just getting our minute or two to see if anyone else wants to come on, respond. So yeah, we have a lot of enthusiasts of 10 people at least already on who have sown multi-species swords, 3 who are thinking about it, 1 person who is still to be convinced so far. So we'll give it our second and then we'll move on. So a lot of converts here. Okay, I'll move on to the next question then. So what we're interested to find out is, what have you been sowing on your farm? So we're going to start off with, you can put down and let us know what herbs, for those of you that have been putting in herbs on your farm, which of these herbs, tick all that apply, have you been putting on your farm? Yeah, no surprises there. Plantain and chicory are the mainstay, but we have a few of the others, all very popular. I think that's everyone answered, so we'll move on. What legumes have you sown? There's a bit of a broader list here, but yeah, let us know. Tick the boxes for which of these legumes you've sown. Very good. Okay, I think most of the people had about 9. Oh, there's another one coming in, a couple more. Very good. Getting our second or two. But yeah, so again, very interesting. Plantain, red and white, obviously the ones with a bit of birds for trefoil, some sainfoin, no lucerne, interestingly, but very interesting. Okay. Then what grasses have you sown? So even bigger list here. Let us know what you've done. Okay, no surprises. Perennial and Timothy obviously dominating. Some hybrid, bit of Coxfoot, Meadow Fescue, a little bit of Westerwold. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Italian Meadow. Oh, very good. That's 11. I think that's all the numbers we had. So that's great. I'll move on. What we're interested in, why are you interested? For those of you who are putting in MSS, let us know. And you'll see a slider on your screen or on your phone, 0 to 5, or sorry, 0 to 10. So just let us know, score each of them as to how important they are for the reason that you're interested in MSS. Okay, so again, yeah, interesting. Obviously, drought resilience is probably the biggest reason. Oh, well, actually not anymore. Lower fertilizer use and soil health, but yeah, it's fairly evenly done across all of those. So yes, thank you. And finally, what we'd like to know, because obviously we have a lot of scientists on the call here tonight, is what do you think of the R&D gaps? What would you like to see investigated? By Super G or the researchers on this call, what do you think needs to be investigated? So if you can just fill in, a word or two as to what you think you would like to look at. And that's great. Yeah, we're saying obviously persistency, perhaps no surprising, the biggest issue. Silage, obviously your long-term establishment, quality, anthelmintic, GHG. Yeah, a few things there. So, John, hopefully that's given you some food for thought for kicking off the conversation.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for taking part. That's really useful in helping us form the debate. I think, well, first of all, thanks ever so much to the speakers for giving some excellent presentations there and insights into the pros and the cons. As I say, getting lots of pros and quite a few cons as well. And I'd just like to introduce Fridtjan Jones, who's a livestock consultant up in the north of England, Scotland area there, who's got wide experience of managing grazing management systems. And Fridtjan, I was just wondering, have you got any comments more on some of the practicalities of and the other things that people might need to think about in terms of establishing these multi-species swards?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, there's obviously, I've learned a lot tonight, funnily enough, because you hear about the cons as well as the pros, and from practical farmers, that's very, very valuable information. And I think both Dale and James put their experiences across very clearly. When I talk to my clients, the sort of default position, if you like, it'll be for lots of other consultants as well, is you have a perennial ryegrass white clover sward yielding about 10 tonne of dry matter per hectare. And, are you going to be any better off for all sorts of reasons, financially, mainly by having multi-species swards? Now, again, we've heard a lot of the benefits here. I think Dale mentioned the fact that you need to have quite enough of the multi-species sward so that the stock don't take a check when you move them onto something different, especially sheep. So it's finding this balance, I suppose, between having enough of these swards to get the benefit, certainly later into the summer, but not having so much that you can't graze them through the winter, which obviously you can't graze them like you could a normal grass lay in the winter. So it's finding what suits every farmer and every farm the best, I suppose. That's the main thing, is what's the optimum amount of these swards that you need to have to give you the best effect on your particular system.
Brilliant. I mean, I wonder, James and Dale, if you wouldn't mind commenting particularly on how these swards are managed over the winter. That's one of the questions that came up in the chat. And, you know, how do the different swards react to the somewhat challenging weather conditions? So you've got, obviously, James, it's probably a wee bit cooler over with you and a wee bit drier than it is with Dale. I don't know if you've got any comments there, James, first.
Yeah, but you've still got to be quite careful. I cut out, unfortunately, when Ridley was talking, but he mentioned very important things about transition there as well. But the weather, yeah, you've got to be quite careful. We rest for a lot of the winter. We actually tried mating ewe lambs on it for the first time this year. Worked very well. It depends how well you want your ewe lambs to scan. We had as many twins as we did singles, so maybe it's a bit too well. But no, that's the first time we've grazed it really late into the season. So that would be mating into sort of beginning of December with them. And then we'd rest until we cell grazed it pre-lambing. So with us, we're going over on a sort of a big mob in a small area. We'll go over that in March. If the weather is really bad, we'd actually drop off into permanent pasture fields. So we've wanted that sort of versatility. If the weather looks like it's going to be bad for a few days, you're going to poach a very high value lay.
I think James has lost us there for a minute. Dale, I guess you're probably a wee bit wetter than James where you are. Do you have is soil wetness and grazing intensity more of an issue there with you, or would you be thinking about more of the droughts that we're seeing more and more of these days?
Well, to be honest, our winters are pretty dry, and we can graze our swards all winter long. My experience would be very similar to James in that we would put our ewe lambs at tupping time on the MSS, and again, our hoggets at lambing were never better. You know, they're certainly bigger when they're giving birth, maybe 3 or 4 kilos bigger. Again, we would tup them and then maybe give them 100 days rest over the winter months, and then use them for those hoggets pre-lambing, because it's a very highly nutritional feed, and it's really perfect for them because, you know, it is a really good feed, and it means the intakes are strong and they're eating really good stuff. So that's how I would use them, for tupping and then pre-lambing, and then whenever the lambs are 6 weeks old, then they go back onto the herbalize again.
Fantastic. Great. Yeah, and just to emphasize to everyone still listening that there's the Q&A still open, and we'll keep going until at least 8 o'clock. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask, please just drop them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up. I guess, yeah, I mean, with the persistence, one of the important things is how long the different species stay within the sward, how the sward quality stays. How long would you leave it before you were looking to renew the swards, do you think, Dale?
So our first MSS was established in 2018, and the plantain is still pretty strong within the sward, but the chicory is the one that's very, very hard to keep, to maintain. Now, maybe our grazing management and our grazing wasn't perfect in the first year because we're still learning how to use it. And we were using our general rotational practice was we would top it down to 4 centimeters and leave the animals in and teat it, you know, the toppings the last day. Whereas now our practice is slightly different in that we're not topping it half as often, and we're only grazing it down to 7 centimeters now, because I don't think the chicory really likes that cutting low. And it seems to be in our 2019 and our 2020 swards, so definitely persistence is a whole lot better with managing the chicory better by not cutting it low and not cutting it as often as well.
Brilliant. And in terms of establishing James, you were saying that you direct drilling. One of the questions we've got in from the on the chat there is what depth would you be direct drilling, and is there anything special in terms of site preparation, spraying, grazing off beforehand, whatever?
Yeah, I hope I stay now. I keep cutting out, but I've gone onto a hotspot on my phone, so hopefully I don't cut out. Yeah,
No.
site preparation. If you're direct drilling, take care of the weeds early. If you know you're going to put a GS4 or something like that in next year, take care of the weeds this year. Spraying off is quite good. We find, as I say, we're quite bad for growing annual weeds here, so it's always a bit of a competition against them. Whatever we grow, if it's a reseed, a brassica, multi-species sward, you're always fighting against them annuals. Direct drilling gives us the opportunity to actually spray off and get quite a clean establishment there. Going quite shallow with the drill, it is a contractor's drill, so it's as shallow as he puts it in. We find establishment absolutely fine, whether we've gone on direct drilled into permanent pasture. We've actually done a bit of pasture cropping. I've got some pasture cropping at the minute, so we've gone in like no spray, which you're really in the hands of the forage gods when you do that. But it does work. You've got to get your timings right. That you need moisture for establishment. That's the most important thing, because you're competing against grass. It's a very hard thing to do to try and establish diversity in grass without spraying. Some situations you can't. Soil erosion risks, rig and furrow.
Yeah.
You use what tools you can to try and get diversity in them. But no, big fan of direct drilling here. The main thing we've really seen over the years of getting these multi-species swards going is actually the time of the season we do it. We struggle later in the season up here. I know people down south, and maybe Claire is different in France, but if we go late in the season, it's a big struggle to get them going. The earlier we go, the better establishment we get, the better plant counts we get, the longer that layer's going to be lasting us. Unfortunately, when we did the trial plots with Paul, we did some trial plots a year before. We had real issues getting it in the ground. We were trying to go for early July. The year before the Super G project, we were putting some in, and it was just drought. Like we were putting it into dust. If we tried to even direct drill, you can conserve moisture if it's there. If it's not there, you're not conserving anything. The year we put the Super G in, it was just constant rain and wind. So you couldn't spray off. You couldn't get on the fields. And both them years we've gone in August, and up here, you don't get the plant counters going in early. We've direct drilled as late as sort of mid-June here, end of June, and had really good establishment. If we've aimed for a bit later than that, generally normally the weather has put us back a bit, and that really does hinder. If we can get in early, a spring or May, sort of late May, ideal for direct drilling.
So in terms of renewal, I'm just obviously it's a costly thing to do. I mean, I guess the seed's not particularly cheap either in terms of when you're establishing it. So when do you reckon the kind of trade-off between persistence and taking the plunge and going for a reseed comes into it? What's the cost benefit of that, do you think?
We see it in basically.
How long would we leave it?
How long would it in terms of the new lay, was that, or in terms of?
Yeah.
So the big cost benefit we see is that persistent high quality feed late in the season that we can't get off ryegrasses. Animal performance, stock and density, live weight gain, and a huge increase in live weight per hectare, because you're eating really high quality forage that doesn't go to seed, apart from chickpea or bolt and stuff in its second year onwards. But if you can manage a sward for that, you're generally always eating something that's very good quality and growing better later season than grass will. So your sort of return is in being able to provide high quality forage for finishing stock. How you put it in the ground, we see a benefit that from direct drilling over your cultivation. That's, I suppose, a personal choice. I prefer try and preserve my soil health and, I don't know, burn diesel and wear a lot of metal, but some people love cultivation and it works on their system. It's great. If you've got my weed bird and it doesn't work, it's a pain in the, that's a pain. So we work with what we can. But so the
Fantastic.
cost benefit, as you said, the seed's expensive. So when you try pasture crop and you're putting it in with ground you can't spray on, you want good establishment. I would say I put mine in a month later than planned this year. It was actually 13 months later. I've had the seed sitting there to do some pasture cropping. We didn't have the weather last year. To do that, we find we really have to hammer off a lay in the winter. It knocks it back in the spring, plunge it up. So we'll singles will go on a field, sacrifice field, really trash it. If you can get that seed in and get it germinating quickly, it works. If you're trying to put it in an established lay, it's not really worth it. You're not going to get it. There's too much competition. It will get smothered.
Okay.
And that is a pricey thing to try. If it works, it's good. But I say, what's it, 30 quid if you're getting a contractor in to spray off a field per hectare. It's not the most expensive thing to do in terms of a reseed, really.
Yeah. Just thinking about, I mean, obviously, soil nutrient status and all the rest of it's important as well. And the questions we've got in the chat, particularly for the herbal species, I guess there's a little less information around, particularly for soil pH. David, have you got any thoughts on that?
I think it's broadly similar to the pH requirements for legumes. You know, you're going to want to be up into that 6.2 to 6.5. But I know that I've come across some literature where I've read plantain and chicory can tolerate slightly acidic soils. I wouldn't want to risk it. I would rather keep it up because at the heart of the multi-species sward, the legume is like the engine. You know, so it's providing the nitrogen. If your objective is also to drive down your nitrogen inputs, you'll need that legume to survive. So I would dictate the pH answer by the legume requirement, 6.2 to 6.5, and I think that'll be adequate as well for the herbs.
Brilliant. And I guess, you know, soil type wise, James was saying about, you know, establishing it as and timeliness and all the rest of it. Dale, have you got any experiences of which soil types it's best to try with?
Not really, to be honest. I'm sort of working with the one soil type, and unfortunately, because I'm organic, I'm not allowed to burn fields off the way James does. But it works pretty well in my rotation. I don't sow it I sow it after stubble turnips that I use for winter in the ewes as well, and it works very well in my rotation. I just leave it till the end of April when the soil temperature is warm, because if you sow it too early, you know, the herbs, they need a 10-degree soil temperature to establish. So if I leave it till the end of April, I'm sure the soil is warm enough, and then I really do get a good establishment.
Brilliant. Right. Well, that's excellent. We've got James's clock there is telling us that it's time to come to an end now.
Didn't quite mute it in time, sorry. I have potentially found one soil fertility issue. There's probably something I should run by Paul to see if it is. Okay. Paul mentioned had pretty rubbish pea status across the farm. We've always gotten really well with plantain. It grows naturally. We find it in the hedgerows and old permanent pasture. Like Dale mentioned, like one of our main ways of establishing it, if not in permanent pasture, is part of our rotation. So it follows beet. And for the first time, I've seen a sky-high pea status on our farm because we followed beet that was grazed in situ, and then we were feeding silage, and you put quite a bit of pea on to feed the beet. It's all gone back into the soil. There'll be pea coming in from the silage. So we've actually got a field that's jumped from about 2 to indices 5 on pea. So it's really shot up within a couple of years. It's the first time I've seen persistency on plantain on this farm. Everything else in the mix is doing all right, but on that particular block, the plantain has done poorly, and that's always been the one thing that stays all right on this place. Wow. So that would be interesting going forward to see if that will have an effect on the on-grown plantain, maybe other species as well.
Yeah, no, well, this is it. Anything that influences the availability of the phosphate is going to be of interest, isn't it? Because I mean, generally, it will vary very much depending on the soil type and the nutrient status of the soil and how the plants interact with the soils is going to be an interesting part of soil health. David there was showing all the impacts on earthworms and the like as well, but you know, it'd be interesting to see what impact they're likely to have on the chemistry as well. That's great. But thank you so much, everybody. I've really enjoyed it. Particular thanks to Paul, James, David, Dale, and Claire for an excellent presentation. Also for Sarah there for looking after us and keeping us on message with the presentations and everything. So thank you very much for that. Please, can you also make sure that we'd be very grateful if you could fill the survey, which will come out straight away after the meeting is finished. And also thank you to Fridian very much for coming along, and for Jason as well for all the help in preparing for us and getting it all together, and for running that wonderful survey. So thanks very much for everyone. Hopefully this has given you a flavour for the sort of thing that the Super G project is looking to develop, and it's brilliant that we've got the opportunity to share experiences, not just within the UK, but with our colleagues and friends in Europe, and the circumstances that they find themselves, and we can learn an awful lot from that. And yeah, wish you keep your eye out on the website and all the rest of it for more of these events, and we'll be in touch again, because we'll be repeating these events later on in the year, and who knows, hopefully we might even be able to have a discussion in the open field, which would be wonderful before too long. So thanks ever so much to everyone, and have a good evening, and hope France do well this evening, Claire in particular.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hope the
Allez, les
best
Bleus.
for you Saturday.
Thanks, everyone.
Excellent.
Good evening. Thank you.